Freya in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17, from Myths of the Norsemen, from the Eddas and Sagas, author H.A. Gerber. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 10. Freya, the Goddess of Love. Freya, the fair northern goddess of beauty and love, was the sister of Frey and the daughter of Nord and Nerthus, or Skadi. She was the most beautiful and beloved of all the goddesses, and while in Germany she was identified with Frigga, in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland she was considered a separate divinity. Freya, having been born in Vanaheim, was also known as Vanadis, the goddess of Vanus, or as Vana Bride. When she reached Asgard, the gods were so charmed by her beauty and grace that they bestowed upon her the realm of Folkvang and the great hall Sesarminr, the roomy seated, where they assured her she could easily accommodate all her guests. Folkvang, 'tis called, where Freyja has right to dispose of the hall seats every day of the slain. She chooses the half and leaves half to Odin. Norse Mythology, R.B. Anderson. Queen of the Valkyries. Although goddess of love, Freya was not soft and pleasure-loving only, for the ancient northern races believed that she had very martial tastes, and that as Valfreya she often led the Valkyrs down to the battlefields, choosing and claiming one half of the heroes slain. She was therefore represented with corselet and helmet, shield and spear, the lower part of her body only being clad in the usual flowing feminine garb. Freya transported the chosen slain to Volksfang, where they were duly entertained. There she also welcomed all pure maidens and faithful wives, that they might enjoy the company of their lovers and husbands after death. The joys of her abode were so enticing to the heroic northern women that they often rushed into battle where their loved ones were slain, hoping to meet with the same fate, or they fell upon their swords, or were voluntarily burned on the same funeral pyre as the remains of their beloved. As Freya was believed to lend a favorable ear to lovers' prayers, she was often invoked by them, and it was customary to compose in her honor love songs which were sung on all festive occasions, her very name in Germany being used as the verb to woo. Freya and Odur. Freya, the golden-haired and blue-eyed goddess, was also at times considered as a personification of the earth. As such, she married Odur, a symbol of the summer sun, whom she dearly loved, and by whom she had two daughters, Hnoss and Gersami. These maidens were so beautiful that all things lovely and precious were called by their names. While Odur lingered contentedly at her side, Freya was smiling and perfectly happy. But alas, the god was a rover at heart, and, wearying of his wife's company, he suddenly left home and wandered far out into the wide world. Freya, sad and forsaken, wept abundantly, and her tears fell upon the hard rocks, which softened at their contact. We are told even that they trickled down to the very center of the stones, where they were transformed to gold. Some tears fell into the sea and were changed into translucent amber. Weary of her widowed condition and longing to clasp her beloved in her arms once more, Freya finally started out in search of him, passing through many lands, where she became known by different names, such as Mardel, Porn, Geffen, Sur, Skiliath, and Thrung, inquiring of all who she met whether her husband had passed that way, and shedding everywhere so many tears that gold is to be found in all parts of the earth. And Freya next came nigh with golden tears, the lovely goddess she in heaven, by all most honored after Freya, Odin's wife. her long ago wandering order took to mate, but left her to roam distant lands. Since then she seeks him and weeps tears of gold. Names hath she many, vanitas on earth. They call her Freya, is her name in heaven. Balder dead, Matthew Arnold. Far away in the sunny south, under the flowering myrtle trees, Freya found Odur at last, and her love being restored to her, she was happy and smiling once again, and radiant as a bride. It is perhaps because Freya found her husband beneath the flowering myrtle that northern brides to this very day wear myrtle in preference to the conventional orange wreath of other climes. Hand in hand, Odur and Freya now gently wended their way home once more, and in the light of their great happiness the grass grew green, the flowers bloomed, and the birds sang, for all nature sympathized as heartily with Freya's joy as it had mourned with her when she was in sorrow. Out of the morning land, over the snowdrifts, beautiful Freya came, tripping, discoursing. White were the moorlands, and frozen before her, green were the moorlands, and blooming behind her. Out of her golden locks, shaking the spring flowers out of her garments, shaking the south wind around the birches, awakening the throstles, and making chaste housewives all long for their hero's home, loving and love-giving came she discoursing. The Longbeard Saga, Charles Kingsley. The prettiest plants and flowers in the north were called Freya's hair, or Freya's eye-dew, while the butterfly was called Freya's hen. This goddess was also supposed to have special affection for the fairies, whom she loved to watch dancing in the moonbeams, and for whom she reserved her daintiest flowers and sweetest honey. Odur, Freya's husband, being considered a personification of the sun, was also regarded as an emblem of passion, or of the intoxicating pleasures of love. So the ancients declared that it was no wonder his wife could not be happy without him. Freya's necklace. Being goddess of beauty, Freya naturally was very fond of the toilet, of glittering adornments, and of precious jewels. One day, while she was in Svartalfaheim, the underground kingdom, she saw 4 dwarfs fashioning the most wonderful necklace she had ever seen. Almost beside herself with longing to possess this treasure, which was called Brisingamen, and was an emblem of the stars, or of the fruitfulness of the earth, Freya implored the dwarfs to give it to her, but they obstinately refused to do so unless she would promise to grant them her favor. Having secured the necklace at this price, Freya hastened to put it on, and its beauty so enhanced her charms that she wore it night and day, and only occasionally could be persuaded to lend it to other divinities. Thor, however, wore this necklace when he personated Freya in Jotunheim, and Loki coveted and would have stolen it had it not been for the watchfulness of Heimdall. Freya was also the proud possessor of a falcon garb, or falcon plumes, which enabled the wearer to flit through the air as a bird, and this garment was so invaluable that it was twice borrowed by Loki, and was used by Freya herself when she went in search of the missing Odur. Freya one day falcon wings took, and through space hied away, northward and southward she sought her dearly loved Odur. Frithahof's Saga, Tegur, Stephen's translation. As Freya was considered the goddess of fruitfulness, she was sometimes represented as riding about with her brother Frey in the chariot drawn by the golden bristled boar, scattering with lavish hands fruits and flowers to gladden the hearts of mankind. She had a chariot of her own, however, which she generally travelled. This was drawn by cats, her favourite animals, the emblems of caressing fondness and sensuality, or the personifications of fecundity. Then came dark-bearded Norid, and after him Freya, then robed, about her ankles slim, the grey cats playing. Lovers of Gudrun, William Morris. Frey and Freya were held in such high honor throughout the North that their names, in modified forms, are still used for master and mistress, and one day of the week is called Freya's Day, or Friday, by the English-speaking race. Freya's temples were very numerous indeed, and were long maintained by her votaries, the last in Magdeburg, Germany, being destroyed by order of Charlemagne. Story of Otur and Angantyr. The northern people were wont to invoke Freya not only for success in love, prosperity, and increase, but also at times for aid and protection. This she vouchsafed to all who served her truly, as appeared in the story of Otar and Angantyr, two men who, after disputing for some time concerning the rights to a certain piece of property, laid their quarrel before the thing. That popular assembly decreed that the man who could prove that he had the longest line of noble ancestors should be declared the winner, and a special day was appointed to investigate the genealogy of each claimant. Otar, unable to remember the names of more than a few of his progenitors, offered sacrifices to Freya, entreating her aid. The goddess graciously heard his prayer, and appearing before him she changed into a boar, and rode off upon his back to the dwelling of the sorceress Hyndla, a most renowned witch. By threats and entreaties Freya compelled the old woman to trace Otar's genealogy back to Odin, and to every name every individual in turn, with a synopsis of his achievements. Thus, fearing lest her votary's memory should be unable to retain so many details, Freya further compelled Hyndla to brew a potion of remembrance, which she gave him to drink. He shall drink delicious draughts, all the gods I pray, to favour Otur. Simon's Edda, Thrope's translation. Thus prepared, Otar presented himself before the thing on the appointed day, and glibly reciting his pedigree, he named so many more ancestors than Angantyr could recollect, that he was easily awarded possession of the property he coveted. A duty 'tis to act, so that the young prince his paternal heritage may have, after his kindred. Simon's Edda, Thrope's translation. Husbands of Freya. Freya was so beautiful that all the gods, giants, and dwarves longed for her love, and in turn tried to secure her as wife. But Freya scorned the ugly giants, and refused even Thrym when urged to accept him by Loki and Thor. She was not so obdurate where the gods themselves were concerned, if the various mythologies are to be believed, for as the personification of the earth she is said to have wedded Odin, the sky, Frey, the fruitful rain, Odur, the sunshine, etc., until it seems as if she deserves the accusation hurled against her by the archfiend Loki of having loved and wedded all the gods in turn. Worship of Freya. It was customary on solemn occasions to drink Freya's health with that of the other gods, and when Christianity was introduced in the north, this toast was transferred to the Virgin or to Saint Gertrude. Freya herself, like all the heathen divinities, was declared a demon or witch and banished to the mountain peaks of Norway, Sweden, or Germany, where the Brocken is pointed out as her special abode, and the general tryst place of her demon train on Valpurgisnacht. Chorus of Witches. On to the Brocken the witches are flocking, merry meet, merry part, how they gallop and drive, yellow stubble and stalk are rocking, and young green corn is merry alive, with the shapes and shadows swimming by, to the highest heights they fly, where Sir Urin sits on high, throughout and about, with clamour and shout, drives the maddening rout, over stock, over stone, shriek, laughter, and moan, before them are blown. Gothfaust, Anster's translation. As the swallow, cuckoo, and cat were held sacred to Freya in heathen times. These creatures were supposed to have demoniacal attributes, and to this day, witches are always depicted with coal black cats beside them. End of Freya in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17.
My Lord Bag of Rice in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17. From Japanese Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Robert Tunick. My Lord Bag of Rice by Yae Theodora Ozaki. Long, long ago, there lived in Japan a brave warrior known to all as Tawara Toda, or My Lord Bag of Rice. His true name was Fujiwara Hidesato, and there is a very interesting story of how he came to change his name. One day, he sallied forth in search of adventures, for he had the nature of a warrior, and he could not bear to be idle. So he buckled on his 2 swords, took his huge bow, much taller than himself, in his hand, and slinged his quiver on his back, started out. He had not gone far when he came to the bridge of Seta no Karashi, spanning one end of the beautiful Lake Biwa. No sooner had he set foot on the bridge than he saw lying right across his path a huge serpent dragon. Its body was so big that it looked like the trunk of a large pine tree, and it took up the whole width of the bridge. One of its huge claws rested on the parapet of one side of the bridge, while its tail lay right against the other. The monster seemed to be asleep, and as it breathed, fire and smoke came out of its nostrils. At first, Hidesato could not help feeling alarmed at the sight of this horrible reptile lying in his path, for he must either turn back or walk right over its body. He was a brave man, however, and putting aside all fear, went forward dauntlessly. Crunch! Crunch! He stepped now on the dragon's body, now between its coils, and without even one glance backward, he went on his way. He had only gone a few steps before he heard someone calling him from behind. On turning back, he was much surprised to see that the monster dragon had entirely disappeared, and in its place was a strange-looking man, who was bowing most ceremoniously to the ground. His red hair streamed over his shoulders, and was surmounted by a crown in the shape of a dragon's head, and his sea-green dress was patterned with shells. Hidesato knew at once that this was no ordinary mortal, and he wondered much at the strange occurrence. Where had the dragon gone in such a short space of time? Or had it transformed itself into this man? And what did the whole thing mean? While these thoughts passed through his mind, he came up to the man on the bridge, and now addressed him. "Was that you that called me just now?" "Yes, it was I," answered the man. "I have an earnest request to make to you. Do you think you can grant it to me?" "If it is in my power to do so, I will," answered Hidesato. "But first, tell me who you are." "I am the Dragon King of the lake, and my home is in these waters, just under this bridge." "And what is it that you have to ask of me?" said Hidesato. "I want you to kill my mortal enemy, the centipede, who lives on the mountain beyond." And the Dragon King pointed to a high peak on the opposite shore of the lake. "I have lived now for many years in this lake, and I have a large family of children and grandchildren. For some time past, we have lived in terror, for a monster centipede has discovered our home, and night after night it comes and carries off one of my family. I am powerless to save them. If it goes on much longer like this, not only shall I lose all of my children, but I myself must fall a victim to the monster. I am, therefore, very unhappy, and in my extremity I determined to ask the help of a human being. For many days, with this intention, I have waited on the bridge in the shape of a horrible serpent dragon that you saw, in the hope that some strong, brave men would come along. But all who came this way as soon as they saw me, were terrified, and ran away as fast as they could. You are the first man I have found able to look at me without fear, so I knew at once that you are a man of great courage. I beg you to have pity upon me. Will you not help me and kill my enemy, the centipede?" Hidesato felt very sorry for the Dragon King on hearing his story, and readily promised to do what he could to help him. The warrior asked where the centipede lived, so that he may attack the creature at once. The Dragon King replied that its home was on the mountain Mikami, but that as it came every night at a certain hour to the palace of the lake, it would be better to wait till then. So Hidesato was conducted to the palace of the Dragon King, under the bridge. Strange to say, as he followed his host downwards, the water parted to let them pass, and his clothes did not feel damp as he passed through the flood. Never had Hidesato seen anything so beautiful as this palace built of white marble beneath the lake. He had often heard of the Sea King's palace, at the bottom of the sea, where all the servants and retainers were saltwater fishes, but here was a magnificent building in the heart of Lake Biwa. The dainty goldfishes, red carp, and silvery trout waited upon the Dragon King and his guest. Hidesato was astonished at the feast that was spread for him. The dishes were crystallized lotus leaves and flowers, and the chopsticks were of the rarest ebony. As soon as they sat down, the sliding doors opened and 10 lovely goldfish dancers came out, and behind them followed 10 red carp musicians with the koto and the shamisen. Thus the hours flew by till midnight, and the beautiful music and the dancing had banished all thoughts of the centipede. The Dragon King was about to pledge the warrior in a fresh cup of wine, when the palace was suddenly shaken by a tramp, as if a mighty army had begun to march not far away. Hidesato and his host both rose to their feet and rushed to the balcony, and the warrior saw on the opposite mountain 2 great balls of glowing fire coming nearer and nearer. The Dragon King stood by the warrior's side, trembling with fear. The centipede. Those 2 balls of fire are its eyes. It is coming for its prey. Now is the time to kill it. Hidesato looked where his host pointed, and in the dim light of the starlit evening, behind the 2 balls of fire, he saw the long body of an enormous centipede winding round the mountains, and the light in its 100 feet glowed like so many distant lanterns moving slowly towards the shore. Hidesato showed not the least sign of fear. He tried to calm the Dragon King. "Don't be afraid. I shall surely kill the centipede. Just bring me my bow and arrows." The Dragon King did as he was bid, and the warrior noticed that he had only 3 arrows left in his quiver. He took the bow and fitted an arrow to the notch, took careful aim, and let fly. The arrow hit the centipede right in the middle of its head, but instead of penetrating it, it glanced off harmlessly and fell to the ground. Nothing daunted, Hidesato took another arrow, fitted to the notch of the bow, and let fly. Again, the arrow hit the mark. It struck the centipede right in the middle of its head, only to glance off and fall to the ground. The centipede was invulnerable to weapons. When the Dragon King saw that even his brave warrior's arrows were powerless to kill the centipede, he lost heart and began to tremble with fear. The warrior saw that he had only 1 arrow left in his quiver, and that if this failed, he could not kill the centipede. He looked across the waters. The huge reptile had wound its horrid body 7 times round the mountain, and would soon come down to the lake. Near and near gleamed fireballs of eyes, and the light of its 100 feet began to throw reflections in the still waters of the lake. Then suddenly the warrior remembered that he had heard that human saliva was deadly to centipedes, but this was no ordinary centipede. This was so monstrous that even to think of such a creature made one creep with horror. Hidesato determined to try his last chance. So taking his last arrow, and first putting the end of it in his mouth, he fitted the notch to his bow, took careful aim once more, and let fly. This time the arrow again hit the centipede right in the middle of its head, but instead of glancing off harmlessly as before, it struck home to the creature's brain. Then, with a convulsive shudder, the serpentine body stopped moving, and the fiery light of its great eyes and 100 feet darkened to a dull glare like the sunset of a stormy day, and then went out in blackness. A great darkness now overspread the heavens. The thunder rolled, and the lightning flashed, and the wind roared in fury, and it seemed as if the world was coming to an end. The Dragon King and his children and retainers all crouched in different parts of the palace, frightened to death, for the building was shaken to its foundation. At last, the dreadful night was over. Day dawned beautiful and clear. The centipede was gone from the mountain. Then Hidesato called to the Dragon King to come out with him on the balcony, for the centipede was dead, and he had nothing more to fear. Then all the inhabitants of the palace came out with joy, and Hidesato pointed to the lake. There lay the body of the dead centipede floating on the water, which was dyed red with its blood. The gratitude of the Dragon King knew no bounds. The whole family came and bowed down before the warrior, calling him their preserver and the bravest warrior in all of Japan. Another feast was prepared, more sumptuous than the first. All kinds of fish, prepared in every imaginable way, raw, stewed, boiled, and roasted, served on coral trays and crystal dishes, were put before him, and the wine was the best that Hidesato had ever tasted in his life. To add to the beauty of everything, the sun shone brightly, the lake glimmered like a liquid diamond, and the palace was 1,000 times more beautiful by day than by night. His host tried to persuade the warrior to stay a few days, but Hidesato insisted on going home, saying that he had now finished what he had came to do and must return. The Dragon King and his family were all very sorry to have him leave so soon, but since he would go, they begged him to accept a few small presents, so they said, in token of their gratitude to him for delivering them forever from the horrible enemy, the centipede. As the warrior stood in the porch taking leave, a train of fish was suddenly transformed into a retinue of men, all wearing ceremonial robes and dragon's crowns on their heads to show that they were servants of the great Dragon King. The presents that they carried were as follows. First, a large bronze bell. Second, a bag of rice. Third, a roll of silk. Fourth, a cooking pot. Fifth, a bell. Hidesato did not want to accept all the presents, but as the Dragon King insisted, he could not well refuse. The Dragon King himself accompanied the warrior as far as the bridge, and then took leave of him with many bows and good wishes, leaving the procession of servants to accompany Hidesato to his house with the presents. The warrior's household and servants had been very much concerned when they found that he did not return the night before, and they finally concluded that he had been kept by the violent storm and had taken shelter somewhere. When the servants on the watch for his return caught sight of him, they called to everyone that he was approaching, and the whole household turned out to meet him, wondering much what the retinue of men bearing presents and banners that followed him could mean. As soon as the Dragon King's retainers had put down the presents, they vanished, and Hidesato told all that had happened to him. The presents which he had received from the grateful Dragon King were found to be of great magic power. The bell only was ordinary, and as Hidesato had no use for it, he presented it to the temple nearby, where it was hung up to boom out the hour of day over the surrounding neighborhood. The single bag of rice, however, much was taken from it day after day for the meals of the knight and his whole family, never grew less. The supply in the bag was inexhaustible. The roll of silk, too, never grew shorter. Through time after time, long pieces were cut off to make the warrior a new set of clothes to go to court in at the new year. The cooking pot was wonderful, too. No matter what was put into it, it cooked deliciously whatever was wanted, without any firing. Truly, a very economical saucepan. The fame of Hidesato's fortune spread far and wide, and as there was no need for him to spend money on rice or silk or firing, he became very rich and prosperous, and he was henceforth known as My Lord Bag of Rice. End of My Lord Bag of Rice, a Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17. The Tengus, or the Elves with Long Noses, in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17, from Japanese Fairy World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Robert Tunick. The Tengus, or the Elves with Long Noses, by William Elliott Griffiths. Curious creatures are the Tengus, with the head of a hawk and the body of a man. They have very hairy hands or paws with 2 fingers, and feet with 2 toes. They are hatched out of eggs, and have wings and feathers until full grown. Then their wings molt, and their stumps are concealed behind their dress, which is like that of a man. They walk, when grown up, on clogs a foot high, which are like stilts, as they have but one support instead of two, like the sort of which men wear. The Tengu strut about easily on these, without stumbling. The Dai Tengu, or master, is a solemn-faced, scolding individual with a very proud expression, and a nose about 8 finger breadths long. When he goes abroad, his retainers march before him, for fear he might break his nose against something. He wears a long gray beard down to his girdle, and mustaches to his chin. In his left hand he carries a large fan made of 7 wide feathers. This is the sign of his rank. He has a mouth, but he rarely opens it. He is very wise, and rules over the Tengus in Japan. The Karasu, or Crow Tengu, is a black fellow, with a long beak in the place where his nose and mouth ought to be. He looks as if someone had squeezed out the lower part of his face, and pulled his nose down so as to make a beak like a crow's. He is the Dai Tengu's lictor. He carries the axe of authority over his left shoulder, to chop bad people's heads off. In his right fist is the master's book of wisdom, and a roll of authority. Even these two, highest in authority in Tengu land, are servants of the great lord Kampira, the long-haired patron of sailors and mountaineers. The greatest of the Dai Tengu lived in Kurama Mountain, and taught Yoshitsune. This lad, while a pupil in the monastery, would slip out in the evening when the priest thought him asleep, and come to the king of the Tengus, who instructed him in the military arts, in cunning, magic, and wisdom. Every night the boy would spread the roll of wisdom before him, and sit at the table of the hoary-headed Tengu, and learn the strange letters in which Tengu wisdom is written, while the long-nosed servant Tengus, propped on their stilt clogs, looked on. The boy was not afraid, but quickly learned the knowledge which birds, beasts, and fishes have, how to understand their language, and to fly, swim, and leap like them. When a Tengu stumbles and falls down on his nose, it takes a long while to heal, and if he breaks it, the doctor puts it in splints like a broken arm, until it straights out and heals up again. Some of the amusements in Tenguland are very curious. A pair of young Tengus will fence with their noses as if they were foils. Their faces are well protected by masks, for if one Tengu should poke his nose into the other's eye, he might put it out, and a blind Tengu could not walk about, because he would be knocking his nose against everything. 2 old Tengus with noses nearly 2 feet long sometimes try their strength of their face handles. One fellow has his beak straight up in the air like a supporting post, while the other sits a yard off with his elastic nose stretched out like a tightrope, and tied with twine at the top of the other one's nose. On this tight-nosed rope a little Tengu boy, with a tiny pug only 2 inches long, dances a jig. He holds an umbrella in his hand, now dancing, and now standing upon one foot. The Tengu daddy, whose nose serves as a tent pole, waves his fan and sings a song keeping time to the dance. There is another Tengu who sometimes quarrels with his wife, and when angry boxes her ears with his nose. A lady Tengu, who is inclined to be literary and sentimental, writes poetry. When the mood seizes her, she ties the pen to her nose, dips it in the ink, and writes a poem on the wall. A Tengu painter makes a long-handled brush to whitewash the ceiling by strapping it to his nose. Sometimes the little Tengus get fighting, and then the feathers fly as they tear each other with the little claws which have talons on them shaped like chickens, but which, when fully grown, look like hands. All the big Tengus are fond of trying the strength of their noses, and how far they can bend them up and down without breaking. They have 2 favorite games in which they sometimes give exhibitions. The player has long strings of iron cash, that is, 100 of the little iron coins with a square hole in the center. Several of these he slides on a rope, like buttons on a string, or counters on a wire. Then he lifts them off with the tip of his nose. Sometimes his nose bends so much under the weight that the coins slip off. Whichever Tengu can pick off the greater number of strings without letting any slip wins the game, and is called O-Hana, the king of noses. Another balances hoops and poles on his nose and throws balls through the hoops, or he poises a saucer of water on the tip of his nose without spilling a drop. Another fellow hangs a bell from the ceiling. Then, with a handkerchief tied loosely round his head, he pulls his nose back like a snapping turtle's beak, and then he suddenly lets go. His nose then strikes the bell and rings it. It hurts very much, but he does not mind it. The Tengus have one great fault. They love liquor too much. They often get drunk. They buy great casks of rice wine, sling them round their necks, and drink out of long cups shaped like their faces, using the nose for a handle. A drunken Tengu makes a funny sight, as he staggers about with his big wings drooping and flapping around him, and the feathers trailing in the mud, and his long nose limp, pendulous, and groggy. When the master of Tengus wishes to see the flowers, which means to go on a picnic, he punishes his drunken servant by swinging the box of eatables over the fellow's red nose. Putting the end over his shoulders, he compels the sot to come along. It sobers the fellow, for the weight on his nose and the pulling on it hurts dreadfully, and often makes him squeal. Oyama, a mountain near Tokyo, is said to be full of these long-nosed elves, but many other mountains are inhabited by them, for they like lonely places, away from men. Dancers often put masks like the Tengu's face, and dance a curious dance, which they call the Tengu's quadrille. The Tengus are very proud fellows, and think themselves above human beings. They are afraid of brave men, however, they never dare to hurt them. They scare children, especially bad boys. They watch a boy telling lies and catch him. Then the Tengus pull out his tongue by the roots and run away with it. When a Tengu walks, he folds his arms, throws back his head till his nose is far up in the air, and struts around as if he were a daimyo. When a man becomes vain and carries his nose too high, the people say he has become a Tengu. End of the Tengus, or the elves with long noses, in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17.
The Love of the Snow-White Fox, in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17. From Old World Japan, Legends of the Land of the Gods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Serafina. The Love of the Snow-White Fox, by Frank Rinder. In Izumo, the province of the gods, are many foxes. There the wicked Ninko, in league with the Oni, prowls about at nightfall and carries away the souls of little children. He robs the poor man of his rice and millet, and bewitches the maidens who cross his path. There, too, is his enemy, the Inari fox, who is kind of heart. The Inari loves the children, and warns the anxious mothers when Ninko is near. He guards the store of the peasant, and comes to the aid of maidens in distress. Many centuries ago, there lived a young Inari fox. She was snow-white, and her eyes were keen and intelligent. She was beloved by all the good people for miles around. They were glad if in the evening she knocked softly with her tail against the window of their hut. When she entered, she would play with the children, eat of their humble fare, and then trot away. The god Inari protected those who were kind to her. The Ninko foxes hated her. There were hunters in the country of Izumo who thirsted for the blood of the beautiful white fox. Once or twice she nearly lost her life at the hands of these cruel men. One summer afternoon, she was frisking about in the woods with some young fox friends, when two men caught sight of her. They were fleet of foot and had dogs by their side. Off ran the white fox. The men uttered an excited cry and gave chase. Instead of going towards the open plain, she made for the temple of Inari Daimyojin. There surely I will find a safe refuge from my pursuers, she thought. Now Yashima, a young prince of the noble house of Abe, was in the temple, deep in meditation. The white fox, whose strength was almost spent, ran fearlessly up to him and took refuge beneath the thick folds of his robe. Yashima was moved with pity, and did all in his power to soothe the poor frightened creature. He said, "I will protect you, little one. You have nothing to fear." The fox looked up at him and seemed to understand. She ceased to tremble. Then the prince went to the door of the great temple. Two men hastened up to him and asked if he had seen the pure white fox. It must have run into the temple of Inari. We would have its blood to cure the sickness of one of our family." But Yashima, faithful to his promise, answered, "I have been in the temple praying to the good God, but I can tell you nothing of the fox." The men were about to leave him, when behind his robe they spied a white bushy tail. Fiercely they demanded that he should stand aside. The prince firmly refused. But intent on their prey, the men attacked him, and he was obliged to draw his sword in self-defense. At this moment, Yashima's father, a brave old man, came up. He rushed upon the enemies of his son, but a deadly blow, which Yashima could not avert, struck him down. Then the young prince was very wroth, and with 2 mighty strokes he felled his adversaries to the ground. The loss of his beloved father filled Yashima with grief. He did not break out into loud lamentation, for the sorrow lay too near his heart. Then a sweet song fell on his ear. It came from the temple. As he re-entered the sacred building, a beautiful maiden stood before him. She turned and saw that he was in deep trouble. The prince told her of the snow-white fox, and the cruel hunters, and the death of his father whom he loved. The maiden spoke tender words of sympathy. Her voice was so soft and sweet that the sound brought comfort to him. When Yashima learned that the maiden was true, that her heart was as pure and beautiful as her face, he loved her and asked her to be his bride. She replied very gently, "I already love you. I know that you are good and brave, and I would solace you for the loss of your father." They were wed. Yashima did not forget the death of his father, but he remembered that his beautiful wife had then been given to him. For some time they lived happily together. The days passed swiftly. Yashima ruled his people wisely, and his fair princess was ever by his side. Each morning they went to the temple and thanked the good god Inari for the joy that had come to them. Now a son was born to the prince and princess. They gave him the name of Seimei. Thereafter the princess became sorely troubled. She sat alone for hours, and tears sprang to her eyes when Yashima asked her the cause of her sorrow. One day she took his hand and said, "Our life here has been very beautiful. I have given you a son to be with you always. The god Inari now tells me that I must leave you. He will guard you as you guarded me from the hunters at the door of the great temple. I am none other than the snow-white fox whose life you saved." Once more she looked into his eyes, and then, without a word, she was gone. Yashima and Seimei lived long in the province of the gods. They were greatly beloved, but the snow-white fox was seen no more. End of The Love of the Snow-White Fox in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17.
Mangita and Larina in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17. From Philippine Folklore Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lee and Joey. Mangita and Larina by John Morris Miller. This is a tale told in the Lake District of Luzon. At times of rain or in winter, the waters of the Laguna de Bay rise and detach from the banks a peculiar vegetation that resembles lettuce. These plants, which float for months down the Pasig River, gave rise, no doubt, to the story. Many years ago, there lived on the banks of the Laguna de Bay a poor fisherman whose wife had died, leaving him 2 beautiful daughters named Mangita and Larina. Mangita had hair as black as night and a dark skin. She was as good as she was beautiful, and was loved by all for her kindness. She helped her father mend the nets and make the torches to fish with at night. And her bright smile lit up the little nipa house like a ray of sunshine. Larina was fair and had long golden hair of which she was very proud. She was different from her sister and never helped with the work. but spent the day combing her hair and catching butterflies. She would catch a pretty butterfly, cruelly stick a pin through it, and fasten it in her hair. Then she would go down to the lake to see her reflection in the clear water, and would laugh to see the poor butterfly struggling in pain. The people disliked her for her cruelty, but they loved Manita very much. This made Larina jealous, and the more Manita was loved, the more her sister thought evil of her. One day, a poor old woman came to the nipa house and begged for a little rice to put in her bowl. Manita was mending a net, and Larina was combing her hair in the doorway. When Larina saw the old woman, she spoke mockingly to her and gave her a push that made her fall and cut her head on a sharp rock. But Manita sprang to help her, washed the blood away from her head, and filled her bowl with rice from the jar in the kitchen. The poor woman thanked her and promised never to forget her kindness, but to her sister she spoke not a word. Larina did not care, however, but laughed at her and mocked her as she painfully made her way again down the road. When she had gone, Manita took Larina to task for her cruel treatment of a stranger, but instead of doing any good, it only caused Larina to hate her sister all the more. Some time afterwards, the poor fisherman died. He had gone to the big city down the river to sell his fish, and had been attacked with a terrible sickness that was raging there. The girls were now alone in the world. Manita carved pretty shells and earned enough to buy food, but though she begged Larina to try to help, her sister would only idle away the time. The terrible sickness now swept everywhere, and the poor Manita, too, fell ill. She asked Larina to nurse her, but the latter was jealous of her and would do nothing to ease her pain. Manita grew worse and worse, but finally, when it seemed as if she would soon die, the door opened and the old woman to whom she had been so kind came into the room. She had a bag of seeds in her hand, and taking one, she gave it to Manita, who soon showed signs of being better, but was so weak that she could not give thanks. The old woman gave the bag to Larina and told her to give a seed to her sister every hour until she returned. She then went away and left the girls alone. Larina watched her sister, but did not give her a single seed. Instead, she hid them in her own long hair and paid no attention to Manita's moans of pain. The poor girl's cries grew weaker and weaker, but not a seed would her cruel sister give her. In fact, Larina was so jealous that she wished her sister to die. When at last the old woman returned, poor Manita was at the point of death. The visitor bent over the sick girl and then asked her sister if she had given Manita the seeds. Larina showed her the empty bag and said she had given them as directed. The old woman searched the house, but of course could not find the seeds. She then asked Larina again if she had given them to Manita. Again, the cruel girl said she had done so. Suddenly, the room was filled with a blinding light, and when Larina could see once more, in the place of the old woman stood a beautiful fairy, holding the now well Manita in her arms. She pointed to Larina and said, "I am the poor woman who asked for rice. I wish to know your hearts. You were cruel and Manita was kind. So she shall live with me in my island home in the lake. As for you, because you tried to do evil to your good sister, you shall sit at the bottom of the lake forever, combing out the seeds you have hidden in your hair." Then she clapped her hands and a number of elves appeared and carried the struggling Larina away. "Come," said the fairy to Manita, and she carried her to her beautiful home, where she lives in peace and happiness. As for Larina, she sits at the bottom of the lake and combs her hair. As she combs a seed out, another comes in, and every seed that is combed out becomes a green plant that floats out of the lake and down the Pasig. End of Manita and Larina in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17.
Bimini and the Fountain of Youth, in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17, from Tales of the Enchanted Islands of the Atlantic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ashley Dawn Ryder, Bimini and the Fountain of Youth, by Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Bimini and the Fountain of Youth. When Juan Ponce de Leon set forth from Puerto Rico, March 13, 1512, to seek the island of Bimini and its Fountain of Youth, he was moved by the love of adventure more than that of juvenility, for he was then but about 50, a time when a cavalier of his day thought himself but in his prime. He looked indeed with perpetual sorrow, as much of it as a Spaniard of those days could feel, upon his kinsman, Louis Ponce, once a renowned warrior, but on whom age had already, at 65, laid its hand in earnest. There was little in this slowly moving veteran to recall one who had shot through the lists at the tournament, and had advanced with his short sword at the bullfight, who had ruled his vassals, and won the love of high-born women. It was vain hope of restored youth which had brought Don Louis from Spain to Puerto Rico 4 years before, and when Ponce de Leon had subdued that island, his older kinsman was forever beseeching him to carry his flag farther, and not stop till he had reached Bimini, and sought the Fountain of Youth. "For what end," he said, "should you stay here longer, and lord it over these miserable natives? Let us go where we can bathe in those enchanted waters, and be young once more. I need it, and you will need it ere long." "How know we," said his kinsman, "that there is any such place?" "All I know," said Louis. "Peter Martyr said that there is in Bimini a continual spring of running water of such marvellous virtue that the water thereof, being drunk, perhaps with some diet, maketh old men young." And he adds that an Indian grievously oppressed with old age, moved with the fame of that fountain, and allured through the love of longer life, went to an island near unto the country of Florida to drink of the desired fountain. And, having well drunk and washed himself for many days with the appointed remedies, by them who kept the bath, he is reported to have brought home a manly strength, and to have used all manly exercises. "Let us therefore go hither," he cried, "and be like him." They set sail with 3 brigantines, and found without difficulty the island of Bimini among the Lucayos, or Bahamas, islands. But when they searched for the Fountain of Youth, they were pointed farther westward, to Florida, where there was said to be a river of the same magic powers, called the Jordan. Touching at Many, a fair island green with trees, and occupied by a gentle population till then undisturbed, it was not strange if, nearing the coast of Florida, both Juan Ponce de Leon and his more impatient cousin expected to find the Fountain of Youth. They came at last to an inlet, which led invitingly up among wooded banks and flowery valleys, and here the older knight said, "Let us disembark here, and strike inland. My heart tells me that here, at last, will be found the Fountain of Youth." "Nonsense," said Juan. "Our way lies by water." "Then leave me here with my men," said Louis. He had brought with him 5 servants, mostly veterans, from his own estate in Spain. A fierce discussion ended in Louis obtaining his wish, and being left for a fortnight of exploration, his kinsman promising to come for him again at the mouth of the river St. John. The men left on shore were themselves past middle age, and, the more eager for their quest, they climbed a hill and watched the brigantines disappear in the distance, then set up a cross, which they had brought with them, and prayed before it bareheaded. Sending the youngest of his men up to the top of a tree, Louis learned from him that they were on an island, after all, and this cheered him much, as making it more likely that they should find the Fountain of Youth. He saw that the ground was pawed up, as if in a cattle range, and that there was a path leading to huts. Taking this path, they met 50 Indian bowmen, who, whether large or not, seemed to them like giants. The Spaniards gave them beads and hawk bells, and each received in return an arrow as a token of friendship. The Indians promised them food in the morning, and brought fish, roots, and pure water, and, finding them chilly from the coldness of the night, carried them in their arms to their homes, first making 4 or 5 large fires on the way. At the houses there were many fires, and the Spaniards would have been wholly comfortable had they not thought it just possible that they were to be offered as a sacrifice. Still fearing this, they left their Indian friends after a few days and traversed the country, stopping at every spring or fountain to test its quality. Alas! They all grew older and more worn in look as time went on, and farther from the Fountain of Youth. After a time, they came upon new tribes of Indians, and as they went farther from the coast, these people seemed more and more friendly. They treated the white men as if come from heaven, brought them food, made them houses, carried every burden for them. Some had bows and went upon the hills for deer, and brought 6 every night for their guests. Others killed hares and rabbits by arranging themselves in a circle and striking down the game with bullets of wood as it ran from one to another through the woods. All this game was brought to the visitors to be breathed upon and blessed, and when this had been done for several hundred people, it became troublesome. The women also brought wild fruit, and would eat nothing till the guests had seen and touched it. If the visitors seemed offended, the natives were terrified, and apparently thought that they should die unless they had the favor of these wise and good men. Farther on, people did not come out into the paths to gather around them, as the first had done, but stayed meekly in their houses, sitting with their faces turned to the wall, and with their property heaped in the middle of the room. From these people the travelers received many valuable skins and other gifts. Whether there was a fountain, the natives readily showed it, but apparently knew nothing of any miraculous gift. Yet they themselves were in such fine physical condition, and seemed so young and so active, and it was as if they had already bathed in some magic spring. They had wonderful endurance of heat and cold, and such health that when their bodies were pierced through and through by arrows, they would recover rapidly from their wounds. These things convinced the Spaniards that, even if the Indians would not disclose the source of all their bodily freshness, it must, at any rate, lie somewhere in the neighborhood. Yet a little while, no doubt, and their visitors would reach it. It was a strange journey for these gray and careworn men as they passed up the defiles and valleys along the St. John's River, beyond the spot where now spreads the city of Jacksonville, and even up to the woods and springs about Magnolia and Green Cove. Yellow jasmines trailed their festoons above their heads, wild roses grew at their feet. The air was filled with the aromatic odors of pine or sweet bay. The long gray moss hung from the live oak branches. Birds and butterflies of wonderful hues fluttered around them, and strange lizards crossed their paths, or looked with dull and blinking eyes from the branches. They came, at last, to one spring, which widened into a natural basin, and which was so deliciously aromatic that Louise Ponce said on emerging, "It is enough. I have bathed in the fountain of youth, and henceforth I am young." His companions tried it, and said the same. The fountain of youth is found. No time must now be lost in proclaiming the great discovery. They obtained a boat from the natives, who wept at parting with the white strangers whom they had so loved. In this boat they proposed to reach the mouth of the St. John, meet Juan Ponce de Leon, and carry back the news to Spain. But one native, whose wife and children they had cured, and who had grown angry at their refusal to stay longer, went down to the water's edge, and, sending an arrow from his bow, transfixed Don Luis, so that even his foretaste of the fountain could not save him, and he died ere reaching the mouth of the river. If Don Luis ever reached what he sought, it was in another world, but those who have ever bathed in Green Cove Spring, near Magnolia, on the St. Johns River, will be ready to testify that, had he but stayed there longer, he would have found something to recall his visions of the Fountain of Youth. End of Bimini and the Fountain of Youth in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17, read by Ashley Dawn Ryder, Gulf Shores, Alabama, January 13th, 2023.
Origin of the World, First Dynasty, Uranus and Gaia, Celis and Terra, in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17, from Myths and Legends of Ancient Greece and Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Bill Havanke. Origin of the World, First Dynasty, Uranus and Gaia, Celis and Terra, by E. M. Behrens. The ancient Greeks had several different theories with regard to the origin of the world, but the generally accepted notion was that before this world came into existence, there was in its place a confused mass of shapeless elements called chaos. These elements, becoming at length consolidated, by what means does not appear, resolved themselves into two widely different substances, the lighter portion of which, soaring on high, formed the sky or firmament, and constituted itself into a vast, overarching vault, which protected the firm and solid mass beneath. Thus came into being the two first great primeval deities of the Greeks, Uranus and Ge, or Gaia. Uranus, the more refined deity, represented the light and air of heaven, possessing the distinguishing qualities of light, heat, purity, and omnipresence, whilst Gaia, the firm, flat, life-sustaining earth, was worshipped as the great all-nourishing mother. Her many titles refer to her more or less in this character, and she appears to have been universally revered among the Greeks, there being scarcely a city in Greece which did not contain a temple erected in her honor. Indeed, Gaia was held in such veneration that her name was always invoked whenever the gods took a solemn oath, made an emphatic declaration, or implored assistance. Uranus, the heaven, was believed to have united himself in marriage with Gaia, the earth, and a moment's reflection will show what a truly poetical and also what a logical idea this was. For, taken in a figurative sense, this union actually does exist. The smiles of heaven produce the flowers of earth, whereas his long-continued frowns exercise so depressing an influence upon his loving partner that she no longer decks herself in bright and festive robes, but responds with ready sympathy to his melancholy mood. The firstborn child of Uranus and Gaia was Oceanus, the ocean stream, that vast expanse of ever-flowing water which encircled the earth. Here we meet with another logical, though fanciful conclusion, which a very slight knowledge of the workings of nature proves to have been just and true. The ocean is formed from the rains which descend from heaven and the streams which flow from earth. By making Oceanus, therefore, the offspring of Uranus and Gaia, the ancients, if we take this notion in its literal sense, merely assert that the ocean is produced by the combined influence of heaven and earth, whilst at the same time their fervid and poetical imagination led them to see in this, as in all manifestations of the powers of nature, an actual, tangible divinity. But Uranus, the heaven, the embodiment of light, heat, and the breath of life, produced offspring who were of a much less material nature than his son Oceanus. These other children of his were supposed to occupy the intermediate space which divided him from Gaia. Nearest to Uranus, and just beneath him, came Ether, a bright creation representing that highly rarefied atmosphere which immortals alone could breathe. Then followed Air, which was in close proximity to Gaia, and represented, as its name implies, the grosser atmosphere surrounding the earth, which mortals could freely breathe, and without which they would perish. Ether and air were separated from each other by divinities called Nephili. These were their restless and wandering sisters, who existed in the form of clouds, ever floating between ether and air. Gaia also produced the mountains, and Pontus the sea. She united herself with the latter, and their offspring were the sea deities Nereus, Thaumas, Phorcys, Ceto, and Eurybia. Coexistent with Uranus and Gaia were two mighty powers who were also the offspring of chaos. These were Erebus, darkness, and Nyx, night, who formed a striking contrast to this cheerful light of heaven and the bright smiles of earth. Erebus reigned in that mysterious world below, where no ray of sunshine, no gleam of daylight, nor vestige of health-giving terrestrial life ever appeared. Nyx, the sister of Erebus, represented night, and was worshipped by the ancients with the greatest solemnity. Uranus was also supposed to have been united to Nyx, but only in his capacity as god of light, he being considered the source and fountain of all light, and their children were Eos, aurora, the dawn, and Hemera, the daylight. Nyx again, on her side, was also doubly united, having been married at some indefinite period to Erebus. In addition to those children of heaven and earth already enumerated, Uranus and Gaia produced two distinctly different races of beings, called giants and titans. The giants personified brute strength alone, but the titans united to their great physical power intellectual qualifications variously developed. There were three giants, Briareus, Cottus, and Gyges, who each possessed 100 hands and 50 heads, and were known collectively by the name of the Hecatoncheires, which signified 100-handed. These mighty giants could shake the universe and produce earthquakes. It is therefore evident that they represented those active subterranean forces to which allusion has been made in the opening chapter. The Titans were 12 in number. Their names were Oceanus, Ceos, Cryos, Hyperion, Iapetus, Cronus, Thaia, Rhea, Themis, Mnemosyne, Phoebe, and Tethys. Now Uranus, the chaste light of heaven, the essence of all that is bright and pleasing, held in abhorrence his crude, rough, and turbulent offspring, the giants, and moreover feared that their great power might eventually prove hurtful to himself. He therefore hurled them into Tartarus, that portion of the lower world which served as the subterranean dungeon of the gods. In order to avenge the oppression of her children, the giants, Gaia instigated a conspiracy on the part of the Titans against Uranus, which was carried to a successful issue by her son Cronus. He wounded his father, and from the blood of the wound which fell upon the earth sprang a race of monstrous beings, also called giants. Assisted by his brother Titans, Cronus succeeded in dethroning his father, who, enraged at his defeat, cursed his rebellious son and foretold to him a similar fate. Cronus now became invested with supreme power, and assigned to his brothers offices of distinction, subordinate only to himself. Subsequently, however, when, secure of his position, he no longer needed their assistance, he basely repaid their former services with treachery, made war upon his brothers and faithful allies, and, assisted by the giants, completely defeated them, sending such as resisted his all-conquering arm down into the lowest depths of Tartarus. End of Origin of the World, First Dynasty, Uranus and Gaia, Celis and Terra, in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17.
Baboon Skins, in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17, from Fairy Tales from South Africa. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Curtis Richardson. Baboon Skins, arranged by Mrs. E. J. Borhill and Mrs. J. B. Drake. A Swazi Tale. Now, in this story, there is neither fairy nor Izimu, nor does anyone win a kingdom by secret spells. Some little bags of python skin are indeed just mentioned, but you will see that they have no effect on anyone. The only magic used in this story is a woman's wit and kindness of heart, the oldest charms in the world. Long years ago, there lived a chief who had many wives. 2 of these were more distinguished than the others, for each had a most beautiful daughter. Indeed, their families were exactly alike, for each had a son and 2 daughters, one very pretty and the other plain. I cannot tell you what became of the plain daughters. No doubt, they each had a history, but this tale concerns only the 2 beauties. The name of one was Inkosasana, which means the young lady. Her mother was very proud of her from the first, and expected her to marry a very great chief, and Inkosasana was as conceited as possible in consequence. The name of the other was Lalawi, which only means throwaway. As you may suppose from her name, she was a much quieter and more modest girl than Inkosasana. But as time went on, and both girls grew up to womanhood, suitors began to arrive, and each mother hoped for great things for her daughter. The rivalry between the 2 families became more and more bitter, till at last it was all they could do to keep the constant quarrels from coming to the ear of the chief. One morning, Lalawi's mother awoke and went to see about the Kaffir corn for the day's provisions. To her horror, she found under the grinding stone the blood of some animal and several little bags of python skin filled with charms. "Lalawi," cried the mother, "come and look at these." Lalawi nearly fainted with fright. "It is witchcraft," said she. "It must be some wickedness devised by Inkosasana and her mother. They will never rest till we are ruined. Those charms are meant to cast a spell over us, so that we may fall ill and die." Lalawi then ran quickly to a neighbor, who was a wise woman, and begged her to come and give her charms to counteract the evil influence of her rivals. When all was done, she sat down and said, "Dear mother, I am tired of all this. What do I care about beauty? It has only brought us endless quarrels and wretched jealousy. Give me some baboon skins. They are the ugliest disguise of all, and I will wrap myself up in them and retire from life till Inkosasana is married. In that way, we shall all have peace." That very day, she asked her brother to get 2 baboon skins for her, and to bring them with the heads and limbs still on them. As soon as they were ready, she made herself a complete disguise. She joined the 2 skins at the shoulders and again at the heads. Then she slipped them on so that the 2 baboons' heads covered her face and hair before and behind. Her bright eyes peeped through the 2 eye holes, but her face was completely hidden. All that was visible was the mask of a grinning ape. The 2 skins hung from her shoulder to her knee, back and front. One could still see that her limbs were pretty and well turned, but her laughing face and ivory teeth were hidden completely, and so were her graceful shoulders. In fact, she looked like a girl afflicted with some great deformity, who is obliged to hide herself from the gaze of men. As soon as her rival's mother heard of her decision, she laughed heartily and said, "This is the best news I have heard for many a long day. What a fool that girl is, to be sure. She must be mad." All the women in the kraal were of the same opinion. They had never heard of anyone hiding a pretty face before, and could not believe that Lalawi did it all to have peace and save her family from calamity. In spite of all the remarks that were made, she never faltered, but wore her ugly baboon skins every day, and never once showed her face even to her girlfriends. Great peace reigned in the kraal after the first few days. There were no more quarrels. Everyone was quite happy, and Inkosasana remained the undisputed beauty of the countryside. But one day, when Lalawi had worn the baboon skins many months, there was a great stir in the kraal. 2 counselors had arrived from a very mighty chief, seeking not one bride, but 2 for their master. Both must be beautiful. The chief was very rich and would make a magnificent marriage gift to the father of a really lovely maiden. The two counselors sat long in conversation with the head of the kraal, while the women stood in little knots and talked excitedly. Presently they were asked to come forward, and the demand of the great chief was made known. The mother of Inkosasana at once advanced with an air of triumph. "Here," said she, "is the bride you are looking for," and she showed them Inkosasana, who did indeed look charming. She had thrown aside her cloak and appeared decked in all her prettiest beads, which set off her beautiful skin and graceful figure to full advantage. The counselors both said at once, "This is the most beautiful girl we have yet seen. We accept her with pleasure. Our king could not wish for a more lovely woman." Then, turning to the father, they said, "Have you another pretty daughter, so that we may see her?" The father said nothing, but the mother of Inkosasana, mad with gratified pride and longing to triumph yet further, called out, "Yes, there is another daughter, but she is always wrapped in baboon skins, and is of no consequence at all." "Let us see her," said the counselors, who felt curious at once. Lalawee stepped forward, very reluctantly, holding her skins tightly around her, but nothing could take away from the grace of her pretty limbs, and the counselors walked round her and longed to see her face. "What are you hiding under those skins?" they said. "You have very pretty limbs, and you walk gracefully. What is wrong with you? We beg you to show us your face." "No," said Lalawee. "He who marries me must marry me for myself alone, not for my beauty." "Are you deformed then, or are you very ugly?" "I did not say so," answered Lalawee quietly. "All I said was that he who marries me must marry me for myself alone. But why do you do this strange thing?" "To please myself," said Lalawee. "You must be deformed," said one counselor, hoping to make her angry. "I did not say so," answered the girl, and although the counselors did all they could to provoke her and make her throw off her skins, she did not get angry or speak rudely to them. They confessed themselves beaten and held a long consultation. Should they take Lalawee as well as the beautiful Inkosasana and risk it? Both of them admired her wit and her good temper, and at last they decided to ask for her also, in the hope that all would be well. Before they went back to their master, they saw the brothers from the two families. They told the brother of Inkosasana to make a big kraal to receive the cattle in payment for his sister, as there was no doubt their master would be delighted with her. To Lalawee's brother they said nothing, and he, fearing his sister would not be welcomed, made only a little kraal, sufficient for some 20 cattle. The counselors then returned to the king. He was pleased with the reports they brought of Inkosasana, but when he heard the tale of the second bride, who wore baboon skins, he was very angry indeed. "No girl," said he, "who had a pretty face would hide it. Without doubt, she is absolutely hideous. And remember, if that is the case, you pay the penalty of death. To think that I should have sent such fools." The counselors were very sad and awaited the coming of the brides with much fear, for they could not be sure they had guessed rightly, and the king always kept his word. As a precaution, the king only sent 20 cattle for each bride. "We can easily send more if both are acceptable," said he. "And if there is trouble, for I will not have an ugly wife on any account, then we need not ask for a return of the marriage gift. These 40 cattle will then be the due payment for Inkosasana." At the appointed time, the two brides said farewell to the kraal and set out on their long journey. They walked for many days, each attended by her bridesmaids. At length they reached their future home and appeared before the great chief. He was pleased at once with Inkosasana, but looked with puzzled eyes on Lalawee, who still remained muffled in her baboon skins. He admired her graceful bearing and longed the more to know her secret. "I beg of you," said he, "let me see your face." "No, great king," said Lalawee in her usual quiet voice. "I show my face to no one until the wedding morning." The two brides then retired with their maids, each to her own hut, until the preparations for the wedding feast were made. You can imagine how eagerly they were discussed among the women of the kraal. Inkosesana was much admired, but Lalawee found no supporters. She must certainly be hideous, they said, or she would show her face. When the great day arrived, the brides each left their hut and went down to the river to bathe. They went to separate pools, and neither saw the other. Lalawee descended with her maids to a deep pool under a great rock. The sun just touched the top of the highest tree. Tall white lilies grew on the banks, and in every cranny and nook were great clusters of green fern fresh with dew. Lalawee slipped off her skins, rolled them in a tight bundle, and buried them deep in a great ant-bear hole. Then she and her maidens bathed in the clear pool, laughing and chattering till it was time to array themselves for the great day. The bridesmaids decked themselves out in all their most wonderful beadwork, but Lalawee, as befitted a bride on her wedding morning, wore the deep black kilt of ox skins, which is the dress of married women only, and for ornament just a girdle of white beads around her waist, and an asagi in her hand. But when she stood in the sun, surrounded by her maids, they all cried, "Lalawee, you are more beautiful than ever. You are far more lovely than Inkosesana." And indeed it was true. All these months Lalawee had been hidden from the sun, and she had grown in beauty. Her skin was as smooth and soft as satin, and every movement was a joy to behold. The bridesmaids placed her at their head, and all together they ascended the path towards the kraal. They sang a song as they went, but the song was sad. It was their farewell to a friend who would play with them no more in the old home, and who had come to a strange life in a distant land. At the gate of the kraal, they met Inkosesana, who proudly stepped before them and was the first to meet the glances of the wedding guests. All clapped and greeted her with great approval, but their eager eyes looked beyond her to the mysterious sister. When Lalawee appeared in all her perfect grace, shouts of joy and surprise were heard on all sides. "She is lovely," cried all the guests. "There is no one so beautiful in all our land." When the two brides appeared before the king and danced in the great cattle kraal according to custom, he was struck dumb with amazement, and never took his eyes from Lalawee. When the wedding was over, he called the two counselors and gave them each 20 beautiful oxen. "You have shown yourselves wise and trusty counselors," said he. "Lalawee is beautiful beyond belief. Choose all my finest cattle, let them all be young, and send them as a marriage gift to her father's kraal. Let the first herd be the marriage gift for Inkosesana, but let Lalawee have such a dowry as never been seen before in our land." The king's commands were carried out. Great was the rejoicing and wonder of Lalawee's mother when the marvelous herd of cattle arrived. She had never expected such honor to come upon her child. But her rival hid herself in her hut, filled with bitter disappointment. She sulked alone for months, nor did she ever recover her old position in the kraal. End of Baboon Skins in Myths and Legends Around the World. Collection 17.
The Fight with the Foxes in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17, from Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Fight with the Foxes by Songling Pu. In the province of Chih-li, there was a wealthy family in want of a tutor. One day, a graduate presented himself at the door, and was asked by the master of the house to walk in. And he conversed so pleasantly that in a short time it was clear to both sides that they were mutually pleased with each other. The tutor said his name was Hu, and when the usual present had been made to him, he was forthwith provided with apartments, and entered very energetically upon his duties, proving himself a scholar of no mean order. He was, however, very fond of roaming, and generally came back in the middle of the night, not troubling himself to knock if the door was locked, but suddenly appearing on the inside. It was therefore suspected that he was a fox, though as his intentions seemed to be harmless, he was treated extremely well, and not with any want of courtesy, as if he had been something uncanny. By and by he discovered that his master had a daughter, and being desirous of securing the match, was always dropping hints to that effect, which his master, on the other hand, invariably pretended not to understand. One day he went off for a holiday, and on the next day a stranger called, who, tying a black mule at the door, accepted the invitation of the master to take a seat within. He was about 50 years of age, very neat and clean in his dress, and gentlemanly in his manners. When they were seated, the stranger began by saying that he was come with proposals of marriage on behalf of Mr. Hu, to which his host, after some consideration, replied that he and Mr. Hu got along excellently well as friends, and there was no object in bringing about a closer connection. Besides, he added, my daughter is already betrothed, and I beg you, therefore, to ask Mr. Hu to excuse me. The stranger said he was quite sure the young lady was not engaged, and inquired what might be the objection to the match. But it was all of no avail, until at length he remarked, Mr. Hu is of a good family. I see no reason why you should have such an aversion to him. Well then, replied the other, I will tell you what it is. We don't like his species. The stranger here got very angry, and his host also lost his temper, so that they came to high words, and were already on the way to blows, when the latter bade his servants give the stranger a beating and turn him out. The stranger then retired, leaving his mule behind him, and when they drew near to look at it, they found a huge creature with black hair, drooping ears, and a long tail. They tried to lead it away, but it would not move, and on giving it a shove with the hand from behind, it toppled over and was discovered to be only of straw. In consequence of the angry words that had been said, the master of the house felt sure that there would be an attempt at revenge, and accordingly made all preparations. And sure enough, the next day a whole host of fox soldiers arrived, some on horseback, some on foot, some with spears, and others with crossbows, men and horses trampling along with an indescribable din. The family were afraid to leave the house, and the foxes shouted out to set the place on fire, at which the inmates were dreadfully alarmed. But just then one of the bravest of them rushed forth with a number of the servants to engage the foxes. Stones and arrows flew about in all directions, and many on both sides were wounded. At length, however, the foxes drew off, leaving their swords on the field. These glittered like frost or snow, but when picked up turned out to be only millet stalks. Is this all their cunning? Cried their adversary, laughing, at the same time making still more careful preparations, in case the foxes should come again. Next day they were deliberating together, when suddenly a giant ascended upon them from the sky. He was over 10 feet in height by several feet in breadth, and brandished a sword as broad as half a door. But they attacked him so vigorously with arrows and stones that he was soon stretched dead upon the ground, when they saw that he was made of grass. Our friends now began to make light of their fox foes, and as they saw nothing more of them for 3 days, their precautions were somewhat relaxed. The foxes, however, soon reappeared, armed with bows and arrows, and succeeded in shooting the master of the house in the back, disappearing when he summoned his servants and proceeded to attack them. Then, drawing the arrow from his back, he found it was a long thorn, and thus the foxes went on for a month or so, coming and going, and making it necessary to take precautions, though not really inflicting any serious injury. This annoyed the master of the family very much, until one day Mr. Hu himself appeared with a troop of soldiers at his back, and he immediately went out to meet him. Mr. Hu withdrew among his men, but the master called to him to come forth, and then asked him what he had done that soldiers should be thus brought against his family. The foxes were now on the point of discharging their arrows. Mr. Hu, however, stopped them, whereupon he and his old master shook hands, and the latter invited him to walk into his old room. Wine being served, his host observed, "You, Mr. Hu, are a man of intelligence, and I trust you will make allowances for me. Friends as we were, I should naturally have been glad to form a connection with you. Your carriages, however, horses, houses, etc., are not those of ordinary mortals, and even had my daughter consented, you must know the thing would have been impossible, she being still a great deal too young." Mr. Hu was somewhat disconcerted at this, but his host continued, "It's of no consequence, we can still be friends as before, and if you do not despise us earthly creatures, there is my son whom you have taught. He is 15 years old, and I should be proud to see him connected with you if such an arrangement should be feasible." Mr. Hu was delighted, and said, "I have a daughter 1 year younger than your son. She is neither ugly nor stupid. How would she do?" His host got up and made a low bow, which Mr. Hu forthwith returned, and they then became the best of friends, forgetting all about the former unpleasantness. Wine was given to Mr. Hu's attendants, and everyone was made happy. The host now inquired where Mr. Hu lived, that the ceremony of pouring out a libation to the geese might be performed. But Mr. Hu said this would not be necessary, and remained drinking till night, when he went away again. From this time there was no more trouble, and a year passed without any news of Mr. Hu, so that it seemed as if he wished to get out of his bargain. The family, however, went on waiting, and in 6 months more Mr. Hu reappeared, when, after a few general remarks, he declared that his daughter was ready, and requested that an auspicious day might be fixed for her to come to her husband's home. This being arranged, the young lady arrived with a retinue of sedan chairs and horses, and a beautiful trousseau that nearly filled the room. She was unusually respectful to her father and mother-in-law, and the former was much pleased with the match. Her father and a younger brother of his had escorted her to the house, and conversing away in a most refined style, they sat drinking till daybreak before they went away. The bride herself had the gift of foreknowing whether the harvest would be good or bad, and her advice was always taken in such matters. Mr. Hu and his brother, and also their mother, often came to visit her in her new home, and were then very frequently seen by people. End of The Fight with the Foxes in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17. Read by Luke Seberg, Omaha, 2023.
Kintaro, or The Wild Baby, in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17, from Fairy World, Stories from the Wonder Lore of Japan, by William Elliott Griffiths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Kintaro, or The Wild Baby, read by Quartertone. Long, long ago, when the tallest fir trees on the Hakone Mountains were no higher than a rice stalk, there lived in that part of the range called Ashigara a little ruddy boy whom his mother had named Kintaro, or Golden Darling. He was not like other boys, for having no children to play with, he made companions of the wild animals of the forest. He romped with the little bears, and often when the old she-bear would come for her cubs to give them their supper and put them to bed, Kintaro would jump on her back and have a ride to her cave. He also put his arms around the neck of the deer, which were not afraid of him. He was prince of the forest, and the rabbits, wild boars, squirrels, and martens, pheasants, and hawks were his servants and messengers. Although not much more than a fat baby, Kintaro wielded a big axe, and could chop a snake to pieces before he had time to wriggle. Kintaro's father had been a brave soldier in Kyoto, who, through the malice of enemies at court, had fallen into disgrace. He had loved a beautiful lady whom he married. When her husband died, she fled eastward to the Ashigara Mountains, and there in the lonely forests in which no human being except poor woodcutters ever came, her boy was born. She lived in a cave, nourishing herself on roots and herbs. The woodcutters soon learned about the strange pair living wild but peacefully in the woods, though they did not dream of her noble rank. The boy was known among them as Little Wonder, and the woman as the Old Nurse of the Mountain. Thus, all alone, the little fellow grew up, exercising himself daily, so that even though a child, he could easily wrestle with a bear. Among his retainers were the Tengus, though they were often rebellious and disobedient, not liking to be governed by a boy. One day, an old Mother Tengu, who had always laughed at the idea of obeying a little dumpling of a fellow like Kintaro, flew up to her nest in a high fir tree. Kintaro watched to see where it was, and waited till she left it to go and seek for food. Then, going up to the tree, he shook it with all his might, until the nest came tumbling down, and the 2 young squabs of Tengus with it. Now it happened that just at that time the great hero and imp-killer Raiko was marching through the mountains on his way to Kyoto. Seeing that the ruddy little fellow was no ordinary child, he found out the mother and heard her story. He then asked for the child and adopted him as his own. So Kintaro went off with Raiko and grew up to be a brave soldier, and taking his father's name, he was known as Sakata Kintoki. His mother, however, remained in the mountains, and living to an extreme old age, was always known as the Old Nurse of the Mountains. To this day, Kintaro is the hero of Japanese boys, and on their huge kites will usually be seen a picture of the little black-eyed ruddy boy of the mountains with his axe, while around him are his wild playmates and the young Tengus rubbing their long noses, which were so nearly broken by their fall. End of Kintaro, or The Wild Baby, in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17.
How the Turkey Buzzard Got His Suit, in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17. From Stories the Iroquois Tell Their Children. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Rachel Evans. How the Turkey Buzzard Got His Suit by Mabel Powers. It was a long, long time ago when the earth was very young. Trees and flowers were growing everywhere, but there were no birds. One morning, the Great Spirit drew back the blanket from the door of his wigwam in the sky. He looked upon the earth and smiled, for he saw that his work was good. Today, thought he, I will make big butterflies, to fly in and out among the beautiful trees and flowers of the earth. They shall sing as they fly. Then the Great Spirit spoke, and the treetops were full of birds, but they had no feathers. All day he watched them fly and listened to their songs, but their naked bodies and long legs did not please him. Before the sun had set, he had made feathered suits of every size and color to cover them. That night, as the birds hid their heads under their wings, the Great Spirit spoke to them. He told them about the feathered suits he had made for them and where these suits could be found. A council was called next day by the birds. They chose Ga-Ga-Go-Wah, the turkey buzzard, to get the suits. He could fly over a long trail and not be tired. The birds told him that if he would go, he might have the first choice of the suits of feathers, but he must try on no suit more than once. Turkey Buzzard promised and set out toward the setting sun. Twice the sun set, and 3 times it rose before he found the feathered suits. There were many of them, and they were very beautiful. He could not make up his mind which one he would like best to wear. Then he remembered that he could try on each suit of feathers once, so he began to put them on. The feathers of the first suit were too long. They trailed on the ground as he walked. Neither could he fly well in them. Turkey Buzzard laid that suit aside. The next suit shone like gold. The feathers were a beautiful yellow. Turkey Buzzard put it on and strutted up and down the forest. "Oh, how handsome I am," he said. "But I must not keep this, for if I did, I should shine so like the face of the Great Spirit that all the other birds would see me." And he slipped off the suit of yellow feathers as quickly as possible. A third suit was of pure white feathers. Turkey Buzzard thought it looked very beautiful. It was a perfect fit. "But it will get dirty too soon," he said. "I will not choose this." And this too was laid aside. There were not enough feathers in the fourth suit. Turkey Buzzard shivered with cold. It was not warm enough. He would not have it. There were too many feathers and too many pieces in the fifth suit. It took too much time to put it on. Turkey Buzzard did not want that. So he went from one suit to another, trying on and taking off. Always he had some new fault to find. Something was wrong with each one. Nothing quite pleased him. No suit was just right. At last there was but one suit left. It was not pretty. It was a plain, dull color, and very short of feathers at the neck and head. Turkey Buzzard put it on. He did not like it. It did not fit him well. It was cut too low in the neck. Turkey Buzzard thought it was the homeliest suit of all, but it was the last suit, so he kept it on. Then Ga-Ga-Ga-Wah, the turkey buzzard, gathered up the suits and flew back to the bird lodge. He still wore the plain, dull-colored suit. The birds again called a council. Each was told to select a suit from those that Ga-Ga-Ga-Wah had brought and put it on. This they did. Then the birds in their beautiful feathered suits began to walk and fly about the turkey buzzard and to make fun of his plain, dull dress. But Ga-Ga-Ga-Wah held his head high. He walked proudly about among the birds. He looked with scorn on their beautiful suits. After a time he spoke. He said, "Ga-Ga-Ga-Wah, the turkey buzzard, does not want your suits. He had the pick of them all. He likes his own suit best." Adapted from Ermini Smith's Myths of the Iroquois. End of How the Turkey Buzzard Got His Suit and Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17.
Raja Raslu in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17, from Indian Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Maggie. Raja Raslu. Selected and edited by Joseph Jacobs. Once there lived a great Raja, whose name was Salabhan, and he had a queen by name Lona, who, though she wept and prayed at many a shrine, never had a child to gladden her eyes. After a long time, however, a son was promised to her. Queen Lona returned to the palace, and when the time for the birth of the promised son drew nigh, she inquired of 3 yogis who came begging to her gate what the child's fate would be. And the youngest of them answered and said, "O Queen, the child will be a boy, and he will live to be a great man. But for 12 years you must not look upon his face, for if either you or his father see it before the 12 years are past, you will surely die. This is what you must do. As soon as the child is born, you must send him away to a cellar underneath the ground, and never let him see the light of day for 12 years. After they are over, he may come forth, bathe in the river, put on new clothes, and visit you. His name shall be Raja Raslu, and he shall be known far and wide." So, when a fair young prince was in due time born into the world, his parents hid him away in an underground palace, with nurses and servants and everything else a king's son might desire, and with him they sent a young colt, born the same day, a sword, spear, and shield, against the day when Raja Raslu would go forth into the world. So there the child lived, playing with his colt and talking to his parrot, while the nurses taught him all things needful for a king's son to know. Young Raslu lived on, far from the light of day, for 11 long years, growing tall and strong, yet contented to remain playing with his colt and talking to his parrot. But when the 12th year began, The lad's heart leapt up with desire for change, and he loved to listen to the sounds of life which came to him in his palace prison from the outside world. "I must go and see where the voices come from," he said, and when his nurses told him he must not go for 1 year more, he only laughed aloud, saying, "Nay, I stay no longer here for any man." Then he saddled his Arab horse Bahaunar, put on his shining armor, and rode forth into the world. But mindful of what his nurses had oft told him, when he came to the river, he dismounted, and, going into the water, washed himself and his clothes. Then, clean of raiment, fair of face, and brave of heart, he rode on his way until he reached his father's city. There he sat down to rest a while by the well, where the women were drawing water in earthen pitchers. Now, as they passed him, their full pitchers poised upon their heads, the gay young prince flung stones at the earthen vessels, and broke them all. Then the women, drenched with water, went weeping and wailing to the palace, complaining to the king that a mighty young prince in shining armor, with a parrot on his wrist and a gallant steed behind him, sat by the well and broke their pitchers. Now, as soon as Raja Salabhan heard this, he guessed at once that it was Prince Rasalu come forth before the time, and, mindful of the yogi's words that he would die if he looked on his son's face before 12 years were past, he did not dare to send his guards to seize the offender and bring him to be judged. So he bade the women be comforted and take pitchers of iron and brass, giving new ones from his treasury to those who did not possess any of their own. But when Prince Rasalu saw the women returning to the well with pitchers of iron and brass, he laughed to himself and drew his mighty bow till the sharp-pointed arrows pierced the metal vessels as though they had been clay. Yet still the king did not send for him, so he mounted his steed and set off in the pride of his youth and strength to the palace. He strode into the audience hall, where his father sat trembling, and saluted him with all reverence. But Raja Salabhan, in fear of his life, turned his back hastily and never said a word in reply. Then Prince Rasalu called scornfully to him from across the hall, "I came to greet thee, king, and not to harm thee. What have I done that thou shouldst turn away? Sceptre and empire have no power to charm me. I go to seek a worthier prize than they." Then he strode away, full of bitterness and anger. But as he passed under the palace windows, he heard his mother weeping, and the sound softened his heart, so that his wrath died down, and a great loneliness fell upon him, because he was spurned by both father and mother. So he cried sorrowfully, "O heart, crowned with grief, hast thou naught but tears for thy son? Art mother of mine? Give one thought to my life just begun." And Queen Lona answered through her tears, "Yea, mother I am, though I weep, so hold this word sure. Go, reign king of all men, but keep thy heart good and pure." So Raja Rasalu was comforted and began to make ready for fortune. He took with him his horse Bahaunar and his parrot, both of whom had lived with him since he was born. So they made a goodly company, and Queen Lona, when she saw them going, watched them from her window till she saw nothing but a cloud of dust on the horizon. Then she bowed her head on her hands and wept, saying, "O sun who ne'er gladdened my eyes, let the cloud of thy going arise, dim the sunlight and darken the day, for the mother whose son is away is as dust." Rasalu had started off to play Chopper with King Sarkap, and as he journeyed there came a fierce storm of thunder and lightning, so that he sought shelter, and found none save an old graveyard, where a headless corpse lay upon the ground. So lonesome was it that even the corpse seemed company, and Rasalu, sitting down beside it, said, "There is no one here, nor far nor near, save this breathless corpse, so cold and grim. Would God he might come back to life, 'twould be less lonely to talk to him." And immediately the headless corpse arose and sat beside Raja Rasalu, and he, nothing astonished, said to it, "The storm beats fierce and loud, the clouds rise thick in the west. What ails thy grave and shroud, O corpse, that thou canst not rest?" The headless corpse replied, "On earth I was even as thou, my turban awry like a king, my head with the highest I trow, having my fun and my fling, fighting my foes like a brave, living my life with a swing. And now as I am dead, sins heavy as lead will give me no rest in my grave." So the night passed on, dark and dreary, while Rasalu sat in the graveyard and talked to the headless corpse. Now when morning broke and Rasalu said he must continue his journey, the headless corpse asked him whither he was going, and when he said, "To play chauper with King Sarkap," the corpse begged him to give up the idea, saying, "I am King Sarkap's brother, and I know his ways. Every day before breakfast he cuts off the head of 2 or 3 men just to amuse himself. One day no one else was at hand, so he cut off mine, and he will surely cut off yours on some pretense or another. However, if you are determined to go and play chauper with him, take some of the bones from this graveyard and make your dice out of them, and then the enchanted dice with which my brother plays will lose their virtue. Otherwise, he will always win." So Rasalu took some of the bones lying about and fashioned them into dice, and these he put into his pocket. Then, bidding adieu to the headless corpse, he went on his way to play chauper with the king. Now, as Raja Rasalu, tender-hearted and strong, journeyed along to play chauper with the king, he came to a burning forest, and a voice rose from the fire, saying, "O traveller, for God's sake, save me from the fire!" Then the prince turned toward the burning forest, and lo, the voice was the voice of a tiny cricket. Nevertheless, Rasalu, tender-hearted and strong, snatched it from the fire and set it at liberty. Then the little creature, full of gratitude, pulled out one of its feelers, and giving it to its preserver, said, "Keep this, and should you ever be in trouble, put it into the fire, and instantly I will come to your aid." The prince smiled, saying, "What help could you give me?" Nevertheless, he kept the hair and went on his way. Now when he reached the city of King Sarkap, 70 maidens, daughters of the king, came out to meet him. 70 fair maidens, merry and careless, full of smiles and laughter. But one, the youngest of them all, when she saw the gallant young prince riding on Bahauniraki, going gaily to his doom, was filled with pity and called to him, saying, "Fair prince, on the charger so grey, turn thee back, or lower thy lance for the fray. Thy head will be forfeit today. Dost love life? Then, stranger, I pray, turn thee back, turn thee back." But he, smiling at the maiden, answered lightly, "Fair maiden, I come from afar, sworn conqueror in love and in war. King Sarkap my coming will rue, his head in 4 pieces I'll hew. Then forth as a bridegroom I'll ride, with you, little maid, as my bride." Now, when Rasalu replied so gallantly, the maiden looked in his face, and seeing how fair he was, and how brave and strong, she straightway fell in love with him, and would gladly have followed him through the world. But the other 69 maidens, being jealous, laughed scornfully at her, saying, "Not so fast, O gallant warrior! If you would marry our sister, you must first do our bidding, for you will be our younger brother." "Fair sisters," quoth Rasalu gaily, "give me my task, and I will perform it." So the 69 maidens mixed 100 weight of millet seed with 100 weight of sand, and giving it to Rasulu, bade him separate the seed from the sand. Then he bethought him of the cricket, and drawing the feeler from his pocket, thrust it into the fire. And immediately there was a whirring noise in the air, and a great flight of crickets alighted beside him, and amongst them the cricket whose life he had saved. Then Rasulu said, "Separate the millet seed from the sand." "Is that all?" quoth the cricket. "Had I known how small a job you wanted me to do, I would not have assembled so many of my brethren." With that the flight of crickets set to work, and in one night they separated the seed from the sand. Now when the 69 fair maidens, daughters of the king, saw that Rasulu had performed this task, they set him another, bidding him swing them all one by one in their swings until they were tired. Whereupon he laughed, saying, "There are 70 of you, counting my little bride yonder, and I am not going to spend my life swinging girls. Why, by the time I've given each of you a swing, the first will be wanting another. No, if you want a swing, get in, all 70 of you, into one swing, and then I'll see what can be done." So the 70 maidens climbed into one swing, and Raja Rasulu, standing in his shining armor, fastened the ropes to his mighty bow and drew it up to its fullest bent. Then he let go, and like an arrow the swing shot into the air, with its burden of 70 fair maidens, merry and careless, full of smiles and laughter. But as it swung back again, Rasulu, standing there in his shining armor, drew his sharp sword and severed the ropes. Then the 70 fair maidens fell to the ground headlong, and some were bruised and some broken, but the only one who escaped unhurt was the maiden who loved Rasulu, for she fell out last on top of the others, and so came to no harm. After this Rasulu strode on 15 paces, till he came to the 70 drums that every one who came to play Schaupar with the king had to beat in turn, and he beat them so loudly that he broke them all. Then he came to the 70 gongs, all in a row, and he hammered them so hard that they cracked into pieces. Seeing this, the youngest princess, who was the only one who could run, fled to her father, the king, in a great fright, saying, "A mighty Prince Sarkap, making havoc, rides along. He swung us, 70 maidens fair, and threw us out headlong. He broke the drums you placed there, and the gongs too, in his bride. Sure he will kill thee, father mine, and take me for his bride." But King Sarkap replied scornfully, "Silly maiden, thy words make a lot of a very small matter. For fear of my valor, I wot his armor will clatter. As soon as I've eaten my bread, I'll go forth and cut off his head." Notwithstanding these brave and boastful words, he was in reality very much afraid, having heard of Rasulu's renown, and learning that he was stopping at the house of an old woman in the city till the hour of playing Schaupar arrived. Sarkap sent slaves to him with trays of sweetmeats and fruit, as to an honored guest, but the food was poisoned. Now when the slaves brought the trays to Raja Rasulu, he rose up haughtily, saying, "Go tell your master I have naught to do with him in friendship. I am his sworn enemy, and I eat not of his salt." So saying, he threw the sweetmeats to Raja Sarkap's dog, which had followed the slave, and lo, the dog died. Then Rasulu was very wroth, and said bitterly, "Go back to Sarkap's slaves, and tell him that Rasulu deems it no act of bravery to kill even an enemy by treachery." Now when evening came, Raja Rasulu went forth to play Schaupar with King Sarkap, and as he passed some potters' kilns, he saw a cat wandering about restlessly. So he asked what ailed her, that she never stood still, and she replied, "My kittens are in an unbaked pot in the kiln yonder. It has just been set alight, and my children will be baked alive. Therefore I cannot rest." Her words moved the heart of Raja Raslu, and, going to the potter, he asked him to sell the kiln as it was. But the potter replied that he could not settle a fair price till the pots were burnt, as he could not tell how many would come out whole. Nevertheless, after some bargaining, he consented at last to sell the kiln, and Raslu, having searched all the pots, restored the kittens to their mother, and she, in gratitude for his mercy, gave him one of them, saying, "Put it in your pocket, for it will help you when you are in difficulties." So Raja Raslu put the kitten in his pocket, and went to play Shaupar with the king. Now before they sat down to play, Raja Sarkap fixed his stakes. On the first game, his kingdom; on the second, the wealth of the whole world; and on the third, his own head. So likewise Raja Raslu fixed his stakes. On the first game, his arms; on the second, his horse; and on the third, his own head. Then they began to play, and it fell to Raslu's lot to make the first move. Now he, forgetful of the dead man's warning, played with the dice given to him by Raja Sarkap, besides which Sarkap let loose his famous rat, Dhol Raja, and it ran about the board, upsetting the Shaupar pieces on the sly, so that Raslu lost the first game and gave up his shining armor. Then the second game began, and once more Dhol Raja, the rat, upset the pieces, and Raslu, losing the game, gave up his faithful steed. Then Bhaunar, the Arab steed, who stood by, found voice and cried to his master, "Sea-born am I, bought with much gold. Dear prince, trust me now as of old. I'll carry you far from these wiles. My flight, all unspurred, will be swift as a bird for thousands and thousands of miles. Or if needs you must stay, ere the next game you play, place your hand in your pocket, I pray." Hearing this, Raja Sarkap frowned, and bade his slaves remove Bhaunar, the Arab steed, since he gave his master advice in the game. Now when the slaves came to lead the faithful steed away, Rasla could not refrain from tears, thinking over the long years which Bhaunar, the Arab steed, had been his companion. But the horse cried out again, "Weep not, dear prince. I shall not eat my bread of stranger hands, nor to a strange stall be led. Take thy right hand, and place it as I said." These words roused some recollection in Raslu's mind, and when, just at this moment, the kitten in his pocket began to struggle, he remembered all about the warning, and the dice made from dead men's bones. Then his heart rose up once more, and he called boldly to Raja Sarkap, "Leave my horse and arms here for the present. Time enough to take them away when you have won my head." Now Raja Sarkap, seeing Raslu's confident bearing, began to be afraid, and ordered all the women of his palace to come forth in their gayest attire and stand before Raslu so as to distract his attention from the game. But he never even looked at them, and drawing the dice from his pocket, said to Sarkap, "We have played with your dice all this time. Now we will play with mine." Then the kitten went and sat at the window through which the rat Dhol Raja had used to come, and the game began. After a while, Sarkap, seeing Raja Raslu was winning, called to his rat, but when Dhol Raja saw the kitten, he was afraid and would not go further. So Raslu won and took back his arms. Next he played for his horse, and once more Raja Sarkap called for his rat, but Dhol Raja, seeing the kitten keeping watch, was afraid. So Raslu won the second stake, and took back Bhaunar, the Arab steed. Then Sarkap brought all his skill to bear on the third and last game, saying, "O molded pieces, favor me today. Forsooth, this is a man with whom I play. No paltry risk, but life and death at stake. As Sarkap does, so do, for Sarkap's sake." But Raslu answered back, "O molded pieces, favor me today. Forsooth, it is a man with whom I play. No paltry risk, but life and death at stake. As heaven does, so do, for heaven's sake. So they began to play, whilst the woman stood round in a circle, and the kitten watched Dhol Raja from the window. Then Sarkap lost, first his kingdom, then the wealth of the whole world, and lastly his head. Just then a servant came in to announce the birth of a daughter to Raja Sarkap, and he, overcome by misfortune, said, "Kill her at once, for she has been born in an evil moment and has brought her father ill luck." But Raslu rose up in his shining armor, tender-hearted and strong, saying, "Not so, O king, she has done no evil. Give me this child to wife, and if you will vow, by all you hold sacred, never again to play Shaupar for another's head, I will spare yours now." Then Sarkap vowed a solemn vow never to play for another's head, and after that he took a fresh mango branch and the newborn babe, and placing them on a golden dish, gave them to Raslu. Now as he left the palace, carrying with him the newborn babe and the mango branch, he met a band of prisoners, and they called out to him, "A royal hawk art thou, O king, the rest but timid wild fowl. Grant us our request, unloose these chains, and live forever blessed." And Raja Raslu hearkened to them, and bade King Sarkap set them at liberty. Then he went to the Murti hills, and placed the newborn babe, Kokalan, in an underground palace, and planted the mango branch at the door, saying, "In 12 years the mango tree will blossom, then will I return and marry Kokalan." And after 12 years the mango tree began to flower, and Raja Raslu married the Princess Kokalan, whom he won from Sarkap when he played Shaupar with the king. End of Raja Raslu in Myths and Legends Around the World, Collection 17.